Sutch, the CEO of Intralink at Oxford. And again, I'm going to ask you please to stick to the 8 minutes, so we'll have some form of wrap up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Maria. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can, yes.
Terrific, okay. Well, listen, you'll be delighted to hear that I have 4 slides, and I'll spend exactly 2 minutes on each one, so I won't go over the 8 minutes. So my name is Greg Sutch. I'm the Chief Executive at a firm called Intralink, and I'm going to offer you a commercial perspective and what I hope is a very practical one. So just very briefly on who we are and perhaps why, to some extent, I'm qualified to talk on the subject. We're an international business development and innovation consultancy specializing in East-West collaboration. And essentially, we do 2 things. We help Western tech scale-ups, so scaling startups, to expand to East Asia. That, of course, includes China, but also Japan and South Korea. And we help East Asian corporates to connect with the ideas to transform their businesses. And in our case, those ideas are ideas predominantly in the UK and in Europe. They could be technologies, they could be new business models. We've been doing this for 30 years. I've been involved in the business for 25 years. So we have a lot of comparative experience. A lot of it is anecdotal and some of it is data-based. The first thing I would say, and really this goes back over the last 5 to 6 years, is that we've seen widespread adoption of global open innovation as a strategy by corporates to survive and to thrive. And I emphasize the word global because I think many corporates in Asia, including many Chinese corporates, have been in the business of domestic open innovation for some years. But the growth that we're seeing right now, that I'm experiencing, is global open innovation. And in East Asia, this has been led principally by Japanese companies, Japanese corporates across pretty much all the sectors. But it is now, I'm not sure whether the word spreading is right, but it is now spreading to South Korea and China, and we're beginning to see Chinese corporates to get into the game of global open innovation. So what has changed? And I'll come on to innovation in the post-pandemic era in just a minute, but this is based very much on my own experience over the last 20 to 25 years. First of all, I think the attitudes to collaboration have changed from one that was initially resistant, particularly my personal experience is more with Japan than China. I did spend 4 or 5 years living in China in the mid 2000s, but prior to that I was in Japan for many years, and initially a resistance to collaboration, what we refer to as not invented here. I think then as we moved into the 90s, Japanese firms and then later Chinese firms became more inquisitive and asked themselves, well, perhaps there are solutions on the outside that we should consider. And then moving into the 2000s, into the noughties, and obviously this is very general, we started to experience a greater reception on the part of Japanese corporates, but more broadly Asian corporates, to Western technology and Western innovation. So based on experience, we corporates now know that it can be faster and better to collaborate. And what we're seeing now, and I would say particularly in the last 4 to 5 years, and particularly out of Japan, but I think also increasingly out of China, is a proactive approach to collaboration where companies, corporates are actively reaching out to startups, for example, in the West, with a view to securing the best solutions. And in line with that, there have been different strategy responses, starting, of course, with traditional in-licensing. One of the other speakers talked about that, licensing in turnkey solutions, principally because the core IP was owned by well-established sector incumbents. Moving then into M&A, partly to own the IP, but also as a way to grab market share, and then into principally strategic investing. So in a sense, hedging by taking a slice in an interesting startup or scale up, often via CVCs, so corporate venture capital funds that sit inside the corporate. And then more recently, particularly in the last 5 years out of Asia, an absolute explosion in open innovation where the business model perhaps, or the model of engagement, is a little more general. It is collaboration. It can be staged insofar as it can start with a proof of concepts. It can move on to trials. joint development agreements, maybe then some in-licensing, some investments, strategic investment, and perhaps then even acquisition. What's driving the growth, particularly in open innovation and global innovation? I think there are two sides to the equation. One I've described as push, the other I've described as pull. And I'm looking at this from a Chinese corporate perspective, and therefore from a UK or a Western startup perspective. First of all is a national domestic demographic, so shrinking and aging populations, a shortage of talent, particularly true in Japan. Upstarts, in other words, the explosion of venture capital that has driven disruption by startups, and therefore a need for corporates to engage startups rather than push them away and to fight them. We, of course, are now in a global market, so there are new kids on the block. That's to say that market leaders from other countries are competing in your home market, and therefore you need to innovate more so than ever in order to stay competitive and ultimately to survive. And then finally, some of the other speakers have touched on this, the new normal. And I've really focused on digital transformation here because that is what we're seeing from the vast majority of our Japanese corporate clients for whom we are supporting their open innovation programs. So that's distance health, distance learning, distance working and shopping, and much more besides. And on the right-hand side, again, looking from the UK perspective, because after all, this is a China-UK innovation forum, what is the pull? And I could put any number of statistics up here, and the UK is not always at the top of the list, but it's pretty close to the top of the list when it comes to innovation in Europe. And here I've just put two. The first is venture capital invested in the last 6 years, last 5 years from 2015. And you can see that the UK is way ahead of even the number two, which in this particular case is Germany. And then not surprisingly, the second chart shows the number of tech unicorns. Obviously, there's a direct relationship between venture capital invested and tech unicorns. And again, the UK is far ahead of the number two, which again, in this particular case, is Germany. So that is why we are seeing interest from Asian corporates, currently principally Japanese ones, but increasingly Chinese ones in the UK as a destination for interesting innovation. And then my final slide, to stick to my 8 minutes, innovation in the post-pandemic era. In a sense, these are my conclusions and what am I seeing? The first is, I think long-term investment is taking a back seat, not surprisingly. The focus is on digitization, automation, and streamlining to deliver fast and effective solutions. So people need to deal with the here and now, the problems that are in front of them. It's more about survival than thrival, as I describe it. I think as a result, there has been a reprioritization of open innovation activities, of the programs that corporates are running. There's much more in the way of direct engagement. So that is engaging directly with the companies or the institutions that have the technology or have the innovation capability that the corporate is looking for, and less participation in group-sponsored organizations such as accelerators, which generally, I think, take a longer-term view, and often the startups in accelerators are much earlier stage. My third point is we are seeing greater participation by Chinese corporates in the UK and more broadly in the European innovation ecosystems, for example, via open innovation initiatives, open innovation programs, and vice versa. And that's really my final point, which is there is greater interest in and greater dependency on China by UK startups for both collaborative opportunities and growth capital. And ultimately, therefore, product commercialization and success for the UK startup. Often that is going to come as a result of collaboration with Chinese corporates, and increasingly so. And finally, on the right-hand side, the key focus areas that we're seeing at the moment: healthcare, not surprising, logistics, government, environment, sustainability, work, and education.